Mhm. Good evening, everyone. This is our SAVE lecture night, April 12th. You see on the screen, Climate Care versus Climate Chaos, Finding Our Voices and Charting a Course. This is our last lecture of this academic year, and it will be recorded so that you know that if you want to go back to it, you can do that. I would like to turn this over to Nancy so she can talk a little bit about what SAVE is all about. Nancy?
Thank you, Sister Rosine. Yes, I am going to just give you a little bit of information. I'd like to start by saying that SAVE was founded by Sister Rosine is one of the 3 founding members of SAVE, and that was in 1990. And right now she is our current president. And so this year we will have 32 years, which is really kind of astounding, I think. SAVE is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. It is a catalyst for change linking ecology, spirituality, and sustainability. SAVE has 12 corporate sponsors, and they are the Baha'i Faith of Sylvania, Budget Blinds, Butterfly House, David Wright Financial Group, the Holy Spirit Catholic Community, Lord's University, Lubriplate, Sophia Center, the Sylvania Franciscan Village, excuse me, Wild Birds Unlimited, Lake Erie Waterkeepers, and we just added a new corporate sponsor, Frogtown Computers. So we are very grateful to all our corporate sponsors and their support. SAVE also provides educational, environmental scholarships to students of various ages, of all ages, really. We published a quarterly newsletter called SAVE Notes. We provide public bi-monthly lectures free of charge. And members of SAVE also judge at the annual Northwest Ohio Science Fair Day at the University of Toledo. We collect, recycle cell phones, iPads, laptops, iPhones, and toner cartridges. And every May, excuse me, we honor individuals and organizations focused on environmental change. And this is generally done at our banquet in May, but for the past 2 years, it's been virtual. And this year, it'll always also be virtual, and it's held on May 17th. So you'll be hearing more about that. But we do honor individuals, organizations, communities, and schools. And finally, we also sell local maple syrup and honey. That's our main fundraiser. And these can be purchased at the gift shop. It's a great gift shop if you've never been there. At Lord's University, the name of the gift shop is All Good Things, and it's right on campus. Okay, and we are being recorded, and this lecture will be on YouTube. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to David. And this is what we've all been waiting for.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our April lecture and Tuesday of Holy Week. My name's Dave Sobzak. I am the treasurer of SAVE, and I want to let you know that our lectures are geared around the UN sustainability goals that have been identified. And this particular lecture is aimed at goal number 13, which is climate action. The person who we are going to hear from tonight is Bob Clark Phelps, who holds a PhD in physics. He's worked in semiconductor technology development for 25 years, including 16 years in solar energy. He currently works as a senior member of the technical staff at First Solar. He's also a member of the grassroots nonpartisan organization, Citizens Climate Lobby, and the founder of the Creation Care Team at St. John the 23rd Catholic Community in Perrysburg.
Let me get my lap. Come on.
Someone isn't muted. He lives in Perrysburg with his wife and two of their three children. He enjoys hiking, backpacking, cycling, and whitewater rafting. This man's very, very physically fit in exercises of his enjoyment of the outdoors. He's also begun the process of creating a native habitat for pollinators in his background. Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Clark Phelps.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you tonight. I'm sure, climate change is something that just seems to not go away, right? And we've all heard about it so many times. I'm hoping to give you kind of a fresh perspective on it tonight, and I'm hoping to get your feedback and have some good discussion all together. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and start the presentation now. And here we are, climate care versus climate chaos. Now, to win over hearts and minds on this polarized topic of climate change, it's often been said that we don't need more statistics, but what we need is more stories. We need to understand the impact that climate change is having and will have on people's lives. So in that spirit, I'd like to start out this evening by sharing a couple of stories with you. It was August of 2014. My family and I were enjoying our vacation in Yellowstone National Park. Like most people, we were fascinated by the geysers and we were awestruck by the beauty of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, pictured here. There is something about these sweeping landscapes that reminds us of our place and teaches us to be a bit more humble and a bit more reverent. Meanwhile, back home, a different force of nature was gathering strength. We were staying in touch with the home base because my father, who was then 88, had recently moved from Arizona to be closer to us and was living in a senior residence in Toledo, about 20 miles north of us. On August 2nd, we got a phone call from him. We learned the water in his facility wasn't safe to use. He told us that staff were bringing in outside food to serve residents because it wasn't safe to cook, and everyone was using paper plates and plasticware because it wasn't safe to wash the dishes. Dad was told this was an issue in the city, but he didn't know much more than that. Though somewhat concerned, we understood that Dad was in good hands and that the staff seemed to be managing the issues. It was only later that we learned the extent of what was happening. At 2 a.m. on that day, the city of Toledo had informed the public via Facebook that not only should they not drink the water out of their taps, they shouldn't even touch it or use it for laundry. An algal bloom with unusual toxicity had drifted into the area of the city's water intake pipes, and a strong northeast wind kept the bloom pinned there for 3 days. Years later, researchers learned that the microcystis cyanobacteria in the 2014 bloom had a particularly strong viral infection. So it's possible that the infection caused the microcystis cells to break down, releasing the toxin they carry directly into the water, where it's more difficult to control. Whatever the exact causes, the consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Over 400,000 residents of Toledo and surrounding communities suddenly could not trust the water coming from their taps. In a 2019 recap of the event, the Blaze reported that local retailers ran out of bottled water in hours, and by 7 a.m., Toledoans were driving in all directions on long-distance hunts for any bottled water they could still find in cities such as Lansing, Columbus, Cleveland, and Fort Wayne, unquote. Looking back with comfortable hindsight, one might judge that some of these people overreacted, but keep in mind that at the beginning, no one knew how long the outage would last, nor did anyone know immediately what arrangements the government would make to provide everyone with safe drinking water. 2 water distribution centers in Toledo were set up by around 6 p.m. that evening, and a third site staffed by National Guard personnel was set up by 8 p.m. By noon, the governor had declared a state of emergency. And this is the next image is, what people were doing, right? Going to these distribution centers, trying to bring home as much water as they could for their families. Recently, I interviewed the executive director of my father's residence facility, who at the time of the water crisis was the director of social services there. The facility's bottled water supplier could not cover all their water needs because the vendor supplies were being stretched thin. Obviously, everybody needed water. The vendor told management to use the water that they provided wisely and sparingly. Fortunately, the facility did have its own supply of bottled water on site for emergency use, and they were able to make up the shortfall from their reserves. In the first 2 days, the staff were not allowed to bathe or shower the residents. After that, there were a few days when showers were allowed, but only from the neck down. Aides were told to be careful not to let water get in the residents' mouths during the showering. Another area of concern was the residents who had cognitive impairments. Staff needed to repeatedly check in with these residents to remind them that they could not wash their hands in the sink. Across the region as a whole, 110 people reportedly became sick because of the contamination of the water supply. Now, it's well known that the primary cause of the algal blooms on Lake Erie is the flow of nutrients from runoff in the Maumee River watershed, most of it from agriculture and some from cities. So what's the connection to climate change? As is the case in many recent crises, climate change is one factor among several, and it's hard to say how big a role, if any, it played in this 2014 event. The 2014 bloom was truly one of those perfect storm events. A subpar water treatment facility contaminated by an unusually toxic bloom pushed far enough below the surface to reach the intake pipes. But there's growing scientific agreement that climate change is increasing the flow of runoff and creating favorable conditions for the growth of cyanobacteria. We'll look at that connection closer a little later in the talk. Before we dig deeper into climate change, I want to share another story with you that dominated the headlines just about 2 years prior to the Toledo water contamination event. We moved to Ohio from Massachusetts in the summer of 2012, but we had a little unfinished business to attend to back in Mass. My wife Marie, my son Thomas, and I had been training for black belts in the martial art Taekwondo for years, and our final tests and ceremonies were scheduled for October of that year. So a couple of times we made the 12-hour journey by car back to do our tests and then to get our certificates around the end of that month of October. Now, as we began our final trip back home heading west on I-90, we began noticing utility trucks heading in the opposite direction toward Boston and New York. It started with a few, and then there were more, and then they just kept coming and coming. We didn't count them, but there must have been dozens, if not hundreds, of these utility trucks. It really was just like a military convoy, basically heading east. The time was the October of 2012, and the event was Hurricane Sandy, also known as Superstorm Sandy. We've had many wake-up calls on climate change, but Sandy is one that stands out. The scope of Sandy is mind-boggling. Kiplinger's ranks it number 4 in U.S. history in terms of economic damage at $75 billion. 189 people died. And those utility trucks we saw, New Jersey alone had 12,000 out-of-state utility workers respond to the governor's call for help. But to really understand what it was like to experience this catastrophe, we need to hear the words of those who were there. The quotation that follows is from Cass Holloway, former deputy mayor of operations under Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Quote, "I recall feeling confident in the days leading into the storm because we had been through Hurricane Irene. Many of the players who had been through Irene, if not all of the significant ones, were all there. That morning at like 4:30 in the morning, Tom Farley, who was health commissioner then, called and woke me up. He said, 'You better come over here because the latest forecast came in and said the storm surge is going to be worse than what was expected.' It was within several hours of that the full evacuation order was given. Unquote. Now, the story then goes on to explain that many people who had been through Hurricane Irene figured Sandy might not be much worse, and so they decided to try to ride the storm out at home rather than evacuating. The quotation picks up again from Cass Holloway. The night of the storm at its peak, the 90 seconds that I remember the most were 3 phone calls that I received. One was from the head of the 911 center saying that the system was getting 10,000 calls per second or something, and that most of the calls were for downed trees. Then I got a call from Sal Casano, the fire commissioner. They didn't have enough boats to get to the people who needed them in the coastal areas. Then, as soon as that call ended, I got another beep, and it was Kevin Burke, the head of Con Ed, who said, "We just lost power south of 34th Street." And I was like, "What do you mean we lost power south of 34th Street?" He said, "Well, we lost it, all of it, all the way." It was a moment where you recognize, wow, the forces of this thing. It was like, where is this going to stop? When these kinds of things happen, 1 million people don't have power and people can't get through to 911, it all came to a head. Mark Lavorna, Mayor Bloomberg's press secretary, continues, quote, "I was standing right next to Cass Holloway. Right after those calls ended, Cass looked deadpan at me and went, 'Go get the mayor.'" In this map, you can see that the power outage extended from the tip of Manhattan all the way up to the Empire State Building. In all, roughly 2 million New Yorkers lost power. Subway tunnels were flooded with corrosive salt water. Most lines were back in service within about 5 days, but repairs and upgrades to strengthen the system's defenses against future storms are still ongoing almost 10 years later. This lower right image here shows a coastal community named Breezy Point, which was devastated both by flooding and by fire. The fires were triggered by transformers blowing up as water flooded them. And the upper left image highlights the way in which the flooding tossed cars around like children's play toys. Now, Sandy was another perfect storm event, a convergence of a tropical hurricane and a nor'easter, landing on a densely populated coastline during a full moon high tide. Climate change may not have made the storm larger or more intense, but it did add one clear aggravating factor. The sea level in New York is roughly 10 inches higher than in the pre-industrial era, and approximately 4 inches of that rise has specifically been caused by climate change. Though changes of inches sound small to us, in the low-lying New York metro area, the extra 4 inches just from climate change, on top of the high tide and the storm surge, caused an additional $8 billion in damages, flooding the homes of an additional 70,000 people. Over the next 80 years, as global warming and sea level rise accelerate, the sea level at New York is expected to rise 15 inches more, even if we dramatically reduce emissions, and as much as 4 feet more if there's little change in current policies. The risk of flooding will grow enormously, even in a low emission scenario, unless huge amounts of money are spent to build massive coastal defenses. New York has now begun construction of a 9 to 15 foot high seawall on the east side of Manhattan. The price tag to protect all of lower Manhattan with this seawall is estimated to be $20 billion. So now let's take a moment to review the basic science of global warming. Certain gases, which we call greenhouse gases, trap heat in the atmosphere and re-radiate that heat back toward the Earth. This greenhouse effect actually keeps the Earth at a habitable temperature. Carbon dioxide is the most important of these greenhouse gases. And by burning massive quantities of fossil fuels, emission of methane and a few other gases, and through deforestation, we have increased the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere far above the natural value. We have effectively wrapped the Earth in a heat-trapping extra blanket, and we have destabilized the Earth's climate. Since the Earth is a huge, complex system with many interacting parts, the effects of our emissions today will be playing out over thousands of human generations to come. For example, if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases over the next 20 years, the Earth's temperature would take about 200 years to peak. After that, sea level would continue rising for thousands of years more. So the effects we see already today are really just a foreshadowing of much larger effects that are coming. Now, one of the most important natural cycles impacted by climate change is the hydrologic cycle. Most people are aware that water evaporates from the oceans and other surface water and enters the atmosphere as water vapor. The higher temperatures from global warming are accelerating this evaporation. This causes many parts of the world which are already short of water to become even more arid. And this evaporation can come not just from water, but it's coming also out of the surface of the land itself and from plants. Now, what isn't as well known is that a warmer atmosphere allows more water vapor to accumulate in it before it will start condensing and precipitating out as rainfall. About 4% more water vapor for every additional degree Fahrenheit. When condensation and precipitation finally happen, the result is that higher rainfall amounts on average and more intense rainfall events, more heavy downpours. This is why climate change exacerbates drought in some regions and flooding in others. Some scientists also believe that climate change is altering the atmospheric jet stream and causing weather to get stuck. But this hypothesis is disputed by other scientists, and that debate is still ongoing. But what is clear is that in our region, we're seeing this wet part of the cycle. We're getting wetter and we're having more heavy downpours. And that's highlighted in the map shown here. This map shows that in our area, we've had an increase of over 40% in the intensity of heavy downpours in just the last 60 years. That means that if 60 years ago, a very intense downpour was maybe 2 inches of rain, that today that would turn into 3 inches. The frequency of these heavy downpour events has also increased. So this means that the wetter climate is tending to push more runoff from farm fields into the watershed, and it's also increasing the risk of combined sewer overflow events from cities, where the stormwater overwhelms the sewer capacity and just causes sewage waste to get pushed out into the river, the Maumee River, without being treated. Now, another simpler trend, all of this means, of course, that the nitrogen and the phosphorus are increasing their flow into Lake Erie, fostering the growth of algal blooms. Another simpler trend is that the lake is getting warmer. The surface of the lake is now averaging 1 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than in the 1990s, with short-term spikes up to 6 degrees higher, and ice coverage in the winter is trending down. These trends, along with the higher carbon dioxide concentration in the air and the water, promote the growth of toxic blue-green algae that form the blooms. So although we don't know whether climate change played any significant role in the 2014 water outage in Toledo, we can say that climate change is creating a risk of larger blooms in future years. After water treatment costs, investments which have totaled $1 billion, Toledo's water is safe again. But water costs in Toledo doubled over a 6-year period, and the harm to tourism, charter fishing, and recreational activities like swimming and kayaking will continue until the blooms are brought under control. The outage in 2014 also hurt Toledo's image nationally, and that certainly doesn't help in efforts to recruit and retain workers and families who consider quality of life when they make decisions about relocation. The wetter climate is complicating life for farmers and ranchers in our area too. Not only do farmers need to consider how they can manage their fields to reduce nutrient runoff, they're even facing challenges getting crops into the ground. In 2019, the spring rains felt a bit like a biblical flood, and 40% of the fields in Wood County could not be planted. Although 2019 was an extreme year, it fits into a larger trend driven by climate change. OSU climatologist Aaron Wilson estimates that an average of 5 spring planting days and 5 fall harvest days each year have been lost in the last 25 years because the fields are too wet to work in. 5 of the 10 wettest years in Toledo have occurred in just the last 16 years. The H2 Ohio program is now offering economic incentives to farmers to implement best practices for reducing nutrient runoff. One of these practices is planting cover crops, which are used in no-till farming methods. Often these cover crops are planted in the fall after the cash crop has been harvested. But the fall of last year was so wet that many farmers could not get those cover crops planted. This is a great illustration of the ways in which climate change is interacting with other environmental issues like fertilizer runoff and algal blooms. Climate change is a risk multiplier. And of course, what we're seeing here in Northwest Ohio is nothing compared to what some other parts of the US and the world are experiencing. We all saw the headlines last year about Hurricane Ida, which left devastation in its wake, not only in its landfall in Louisiana, but through torrential rainfall that fell in the Northeast. New York City issued the first flash flood warning in the city's history. At the other end of the country, wildfires continued their recent trend of burning more acreage over an extended fire season, and the first ever water shortage in the Colorado River Basin was declared. The Washington Post reported that 40% of Americans live in counties where climate-enhanced weather disasters were declared last year. This is what I describe as climate chaos. So what do we need to do to turn this around? The antidote to climate chaos is climate care. We need to care enough about our neighbors and about our brothers and sisters around the world that we take action to protect them. So let's take a look at some of these brothers and sisters. I have pictures here of a family in Guatemala, subsistence farmers. The father's name is Porfirio, and you can see they have a large family. And you can see behind him the crops that they plant and grow to feed their family. So what they've been experiencing is rain patterns that are being messed up by climate change, where the rain doesn't come when they expect it, when they've planted, and so the crops simply fail and they don't get a harvest, which means their children go hungry. Or girls like Eva Talaga from Tanzania, who started a campaign petitioning her government to provide clean water, so that schoolgirls like her don't have to spend hours every week trekking to find water to bring to their families. You can imagine what an increase in climate change means for these people. It's much more than an inconvenience. This really becomes a matter of life or death. So we must, in order to care for one another, we must take care of our common home. Now, how can we do this? How can we ensure a better future? And I love this little meme here of these two animal friends. It kind of highlights the way in which it's a fundamental truth that we sometimes feel intimidated and we say, well, where do I start? What can I do? I'm one person. And a lot of people are intimidated and say, I can't completely change my lifestyle around, like this animal on the left. You know, I can't somehow get to 100% zero waste or 100% reduction in my carbon footprint? Obviously, I can't. And so, it is true, smaller steps, as it says here, sometimes get us further along. We can start with things like, reusable water bottles, or maybe eating less meat, which we know, reduces our carbon footprint. And reducing our personal carbon footprints is, of course, a good thing to do and always to be encouraged. But I have to emphasize, and this will lead to the second half of this talk, we must have a national climate policy to preserve a livable world. There simply is no other way with a problem as big as climate change. We must pass legislation. And so I'm putting at the top of this letter, call your members of Congress, write your members of Congress, because if your steps on the ladder get you to that point, that's where we're going to reach our goal. That's where we're going to actually put a dent in climate change. So by all means, start on this ladder, but don't stop climbing until you get to this end point. We have to pass legislation. Now, what does the legislation need to accomplish? Well, here's a plot that shows us what is really at stake. The graph here shows you historical and projected future emissions of carbon dioxide. The black line is the history, which we see has been increasing still, even since 2000, perhaps slowing a bit during the pandemic, but then rebounding to a record high actually last year. Now, if current policies are continued by governments, we would eventually see a peak in emissions and a gradual reduction in emissions. But remember, the effect of these emissions in that blanket of CO2 wrapped around the Earth is cumulative. There's still much more excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere right now than is sustainable for our climate. And so that, if current policies are continued, and this is the trend line for emissions, we're going to wind up with about 3 degrees C of warming compared to what we've seen right now, which is only about 1 degree C. And this will lead to definitely extremely severe impacts. So what we really need to do is we need to be dropping the emissions rapidly, starting now. We need steep reductions in emissions. And to reach the goals set out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, really what we want to do is to reduce emissions about 50% in 10 years to be on this green trend line to try to stay at a safe level of a global average temperature increase of only about 1.5 degrees Celsius. And what do these differences mean? Well, if we can achieve this, if we can do these reductions and stay on this 1.5 degree C pathway, it means that instead of, at say 2 degrees C, 480 million people facing water scarcity, this is additional, 480 additional people facing water scarcity, we can reduce that number in half. We can reduce it to about 240 million. So yes, 240 million is already too many. We don't want anybody to face water scarcity. But what we do, the choices we make, can make this big of a difference. I want us to think back to those opening slides. Think about the panic that ensued when 500,000 people didn't have water available here in Toledo for 2 days. What we're talking about here is millions of people chronically facing a shortage of water every day of their lives. But that we can prevent that. We can reduce the number of people who will be impacted by reducing our emissions. Another thing, corals, we know are so important as breeding grounds for fish, which provide protein for millions of people around the world. At 2 degrees C, oh, I'm sorry, I have this mixed up. I'm sorry for this. This should be reversed. At 2 degrees C, 99% of the corals will bleach. Essentially, there's a risk of most corals going extinct. But if we can hold this to 1.5 degrees C, then there's a chance. Only 70 to 90% of the corals will bleach, and that will mean that there's a chance at least some corals will survive. So this is what's at stake. We can't give up. We can't say we're doomed. We need to keep doing everything we can do to get these emissions down. How do we do that? We have a bill in Congress right now that will do that. It's called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. So this is where I'm putting on my lobbyist hat, and I'm asking you to think carefully about this bill and ask for your support for it. What it does is it puts a fee on fossil fuels at the source, which means at the mine or well, wherever those fossil fuels enter the economy. All of the net revenue of that fee is returned to U.S. households on a monthly basis as a so-called carbon dividend or carbon cashback. And then there's also a carbon border adjustment, which I'll talk about. Let's look at these in detail. But first, the benefits. This will put the United States on a path to net zero emissions by 2050. It will promote the spread of affordable clean energy from nuclear, wind, solar, geothermal, and it will save lives by reducing air pollution. And lastly, it puts money in people's pocket to make sure that any price increases that they may face, they are protected from. So let's go through the emission reduction part of it and why this is so critical. So again, here's a plot similar to the one I showed you before of emissions as a function of time. Now, if we don't change policy, which right now we have really no national climate policy, and if that doesn't change, if it's business as usual, our emissions will basically stay flat. But flat isn't good. Remember, we need steep reductions. So the reduction that we can achieve and that we need to achieve is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says, basically 50% in 10 years, and then going down on a path to zero emissions or net zero emissions by about 2050. This is what we need to do. And this is what the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act will do when it's enacted. It will keep us in this zone of what the IPCC is saying we need to do. The benefits beyond the emission reductions are also substantial. Many jobs will be created when this bill is enacted. Right now, we have huge costs that we know are coming. As I've outlined before, the $20 billion seawall just for Manhattan, right? So today, it's estimated that we have $800 billion in annual costs from environmental harm from burning fossil fuels. But in the future, when we pass this bill, we can create good-paying energy jobs in local communities, both to make solar panels and to install them. We can make new jobs in wind energy, more in nuclear, more in geothermal, all of these low-carbon energy sources, electric vehicles. And we have a lot of experience of that here locally. Of course, I'm, as it was announced, I work at First Solar, so I'm not unbiased here, but I'm very proud of what our company has done. We're now on track to bring our direct employment in the Toledo area up to about 2,300 jobs, which is fantastic, with thousands of more indirect jobs from our supply chain across Ohio, including there's a new glass factory which just opened in Lucky in 2020, which has 150 jobs supplying glass for us. There's another startup in Perrysburg called Toledo Solar, small but growing. There's a consortium that's been formed to promote all of this cadmium telluride solar development. An electric vehicle, the Jeep Wrangler, which is the best-selling plug-in hybrid, is manufactured here in Toledo. And the power module used in that Wrangler is made in Perrysburg, my hometown. Plus, you have local installation jobs, electricians, skilled trades people, rooftop solar, community solar arrays, heat pumps, geothermal. All of this would happen when this bill passes on a much faster scale than it's happening even now. What other benefits are there? Well, right now, we lose 350,000 lives every year due to air pollution, causing cancer, causing heart disease, lung disease, respiratory disease. But in the future, enacting this bill, it's estimated that we would save 4.5 million lives over the next 50 years because of cleaner air. And finally, money in your pocket. As we said, of course, we know that when we put this fee on the fossil fuels, then prices are going to go up. You know, a gallon of gasoline will be, after 10 years, about $1 more expensive than it is today. And of course, in the current environment, everyone's concerned about inflation and the high cost of gasoline. But although gasoline would go up as a result of this bill, that money is coming back into families' bank accounts every month through this dividend. So in year 10 of this policy, a family of 4 would be getting almost $3,000 a year to protect them from those price increases. And they can spend this money however they want. They can use it to try to make energy efficiency improvements or save up for, let's say, an electric vehicle, but they can spend it on health care or whatever it is. I mean, everyone has flexibility in spending this money however they would like to spend it. So the last slide is here about Citizens Climate Lobby. This gives you a little bit of background on us. We really are a grassroots organization. We're powered by volunteers across the entire country. We have 330 supporters right here in Ohio's 5th District, and I hope that you'll consider joining us in this effort. We're strictly nonprofit, nonpartisan, and we really value building relationships both in our community and with our members of Congress so that we can convince them to take the steps that need to be taken. But we're a nationwide organization, and that's what really gives us the ability to get this kind of measure enacted. This is the kind of support that you need to get a bill through Congress. We have chapters here, both in Perrysburg and in Toledo, and I encourage you strongly, check us out. If this is something that you want to support, please come join us. Together, we can do this, and we can truly move from climate chaos to climate care. That's the conclusion of my talk, and I'll be happy to try to answer any questions or take your comments, and I hope we have a great discussion.
And now I can suggest to anybody who wants to unmute and ask questions, feel free to do that.
Bob, what do we, how do we convince people that this is really important? I lost my train of thought a little bit. I wanted to say about something specific. Let me think here. Oh, for example, I just saw on TV all the people that are moving to the coastlines, moving towards California, northeast and south because of the weather that's supposed to be so wonderful there. How do we, you know, it just seems like those parts of our country are the ones that are going to suffer the most, but people are moving there. How do we get that message out there that that's not the best thing to do?
Right. Yeah, it's true. You're right. We're doing a lot of things today that don't really make sense when you look at what is happening and what's going to happen. And I think it's about leadership, right? In the end, it's about finding and encouraging political leaders who are going to tell the truth about this story to the American people and start the process of making the changes we need to make. And I think that is happening. You know, you see in South Florida, for example, they are taking measures there. They're installing pumps that will pump seawater that's infiltrating the ground back out into the ocean, and they're working on elevating roadways. And these things cost money, and they're passing bond measures in order to fund them. So, you know, I think there are areas of the country where there's an awareness that's growing of the scope of the problem and what's going to have to be done to face it. But I agree with you, it's not enough. There are still too many bad decisions that we're making. I think in the particular case of people living on the coast, there's a very important issue, which is the National Flood Insurance Program. And I think it's many, critics have argued that program is encouraging people to continue living on the coast and continue building there, because the full cost of insuring those homes and businesses against flooding is not really being borne by the people living there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that you're starting to see those rates go up. I'm not an expert on that. I can't speak too precisely about it, but I think some of those rates are going up. And I think as more of these hurricanes hit and more of the so-called nuisance flooding occurs, high tide flooding, even when there's no storm, I think the insurance rates are just going to have to go up. And then that's going to drive behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But this is just not a United States issue, obviously. It affects the entire globe. Do you think, or do you see other countries taking an active role in trying to do the things that you're proposing here, or are they being very nonchalant about their interest in it, ignoring it, and in some cases denying it even exists?
Well, I think that a number of countries around the world are definitely taking action. We look back to the Paris Accord, for example, which was extremely historic. Now, the aims and the goals of the Paris Accord have not been realized. Let's be fair and honest about that. But at the same time, it was a landmark event in that virtually every country on the face of the earth came there and said, yes, we need to take strong measures to bring climate change under control and protect all of humanity. So that was significant in and of itself. Now, the response among different countries varies. What you're seeing, for example, in Europe is quite a bit of activity there. Europe, of course, bears a lot of responsibility along with the United States as being the regions that have historically contributed the most to emissions. The whole Industrial Revolution began in England, right? And all of the coal mining that occurred and the coal that was burned there. But Europe now is at the forefront in terms of establishing pricing for carbon emissions. And that price mechanism is not exactly what's described here in this bill, but it's got the same general intent. And so you have seen, for example, a huge increase in the amount of renewable energy installation in Germany. I know about Germany in particular. They have installed an incredible amount of solar and wind. So huge strides are being made there. At the same time, sometimes it feels like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, because they also made a decision in Germany after the Chernobyl nuclear incident to shut down their nuclear power plants, which I think was not wise. That was a very poor decision. And where that has led is that they're now actually still burning a lot of coal. In fact, you may have seen in the headlines coming out of the Ukraine war that as a response to Russia's aggression, the European Union is going to ban the importation of coal from Russia. But they have been importing coal in order to burn it. Well, shutting down nuclear and burning coal is the exact wrong direction to go as far as climate change. So there's sort of mixed results there. And then you have to look at other countries around the world, like China and India, and they make the argument, and there's validity to their argument, that they have different circumstances than, let's say, Europe or the United States. They have much larger populations living in poverty, and they owe it to their citizens to try to allow them to have a higher standard of living. And it's very difficult to do that right now solely using low carbon energy technologies, right? Because yes, wind and solar are becoming and maybe surpassing the price levels of coal-fired power plants, because wind and solar have come down so much in cost, but that's the cost averaged over the entire life of those technologies. Wind and solar have very high upfront costs because you have to build the turbines and build the solar modules and install them. And as a result of that, countries like China and India are saying, all right, we're going to start, cutting our emissions, but it's going to take us some time. And China's position has been, our emissions are going to continue growing up until about 2030 or so, and then they will hit a peak, and then they will start declining because we're bringing up our people out of poverty. So that's what I think you're seeing on the world stage is a mixture of different reactions from different countries depending on their economies and their histories. And overall, when you add it all together, it's not enough. The responses are a start, but they are not, as I showed, and I can go back to this chart. If things continue the way they are now, we're in for very, very severe climate impacts. And so we have to up the ambition, and that's where the United States can be and needs to be a leader. This is the plot again. So, these other lines that are on here, they refer to the Paris Accord. So the Paris Accord, in that accord, countries made pledges and issued targets and said, this is what we as a nation will do. But of course, not all of those pledges have been realized. The United States pledged to reduce its carbon emissions under the Obama administration, but under the Trump administration, we pulled out of the Paris Accord. And only with the Biden administration have we re-entered it. So similar to that, in the United States, other countries have not lived up to the pledges they made under the Paris Accord. And that's why this top banded range in this bluish color is where we're sitting right now, current policies leading us to 3 degrees C. So we need to have not only all of those pledges fulfilled that were made in Paris, but we need even much steeper reductions than were agreed to in the Paris Accord in order to really maintain a livable planet for everybody. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but I mean, there are encouraging signs, but we need much more ambition, much more political will to enact sweeping reductions in greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you.
Bob, I was wondering about climate refugees. What do you see happening with that? Even these poor countries, if they hope to, get people out of poverty and then they can work on climate issues. But meanwhile, how can they, if the climate changes are affecting how people can survive? So I guess I know it's a big question, but what do you see happening internationally with climate refugees?
Yes, that's a very important point. Part of the story of Paris and what happened after it is that initially countries went in saying, all right, we think that 2 degrees C is the limit. That's the red line. We're going to try to keep the global average temperature increase to less than 2 degrees C. Well, after that was being discussed, a number of low-lying island nations, led by the Marshall Islands, but there are dozens of these small countries like Kiribati and other low-lying island nations. They said this is not good enough for us. If the global average temperature increase reaches 2 degrees C, our island nations will become uninhabitable and we will be forced to migrate. And so that's where later it came out saying, okay, no, we must maintain a goal, an aspiration of reaching this pathway and keeping the global average temperature increase to less than 1.5 degrees C. Because under the current legal framework for refugees, which was adopted after World War II, refugees fleeing climate impacts have no legal rights. They aren't considered refugees, honestly, under the United Nations frameworks that exist today. This was never anticipated when those treaties were agreed to. And so nations like Kiribati, for example, are buying land. They started a project to buy land in the Fiji Islands so that their people would have somewhere to go to when they couldn't live on their islands anymore. But it's not just a phenomenon of island countries. You see this in low-lying countries like Bangladesh. I mean, Bangladesh has a very low-lying coastline, very exposed, and much of their current farmland that they use for rice cultivation will be flooded by seawater. In these kinds of scenarios where we get up around 2 degrees C, and those people will also be displaced. And so there's a very high risk of conflict because these refugees, we've seen multiple cases here recently of mass migrations, like of the Rohingya Muslim minority trying to flee from Myanmar and not being welcomed in other countries because they're not seen as desirable, and there are ethnic differences, right? The Rohingya are Muslim, whereas Myanmar is majority non-Muslim, and so there's a very high risk that these migrations will lead to conflicts both within countries and between countries, and that's why the United States military considers climate change to be a so-called threat multiplier because they see that this will lead to instability around the world. So there are things that can be done and are being done. For example, I showed that picture of those Guatemalan farmers. Those farmers are being taught by non-governmental organizations like Catholic Relief Services how to plant different kinds of crops that are more tolerant of rainfall, intermittent rainfall that isn't falling as it used to do in the historical pattern. So some of these subsistence farmers may be able to change some of the crops they're planting, diversify. Instead of just planting 1 or 2 cash crops, have a greater diversity of their crops. This may help them to be able to manage and adapt to climate change. There are many wonderful organizations like the Rotary, for example, that are sponsoring water development projects to help. For example, solar-powered wells that will increase the water supply for people in areas where water is being lost. But I have to emphasize that no matter what adaptation measures we pursue, they will be overwhelmed if we do not mitigate, if we do not reduce these emissions. This is absolutely essential. We need both. We need adaptation to help people be able to maintain their standard of living as best they can where they are currently living and where they want to stay. But we must give them a fighting chance. And when I say we, I'm really talking about wealthier countries and wealthier individuals. It is the wealthy of the world in the United States, in Europe, and in developed countries who have the biggest carbon footprint and who need to make these reductions. That's why the United States needs to lead. So we need to do our part so that people are able to stay in their homes and not become another statistic trying to flee to other countries.
Thank you. Yes.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
What is the current and specific legislation within the state of Ohio that we should be aware of and be able to support?
I can send that out by email later. I don't have that prepared in this presentation, but I have actually been alerted recently by colleagues within Citizens Climate Lobby that there are some good bills that have just been advanced with bipartisan support in the Ohio legislature. And what they are going to do is these bills would make it easier to set up community solar arrays similar to the one that is down in Bowling Green, so that more communities, it's much more efficient to install solar in a community solar array than it is to put it on rooftops, right? Because on a rooftop, you've got to hire workers to come out, and they have to, put up a mounting structure and make connections and do all of that just for maybe, a dozen solar panels on your roof. And so it's a much more cost-effective way to do it in a community solar array. There are some people who have concerns about that because, it's going to displace farmland, for example. There are trade-offs there. So I will, in the follow-up on this meeting, I can provide this to the leadership here at SAVE and have this sent out to you. There are several bills that are in the legislature now that we can support that will help.
Mhm,
Thank you.
mhm.
By the same token, Bob, are there candidates? We have a primary coming up, and the candidates have been more than flooding us with campaign promises. Would you feel comfortable giving us the candidates who seem to support the efforts that you're promoting here too? Or because none of these candidates have really taken on that issue. They're worried about China, they're worried about labor, they're worried about something else. And very little of it has been talked about climate change. Is that something you'd feel comfortable supplying a list to our organization?
I don't think it would be appropriate for me to comment on specific candidates. I agree with you that climate change, regrettably, is just not high on the list of topics despite the urgency of the issue. And I think right now we're also running a risk in that there's a certain argument being made that because Russia supplies oil and natural gas, and that's a point of leverage they have over, let's say, our European allies, that we need to compensate by increasing oil and gas production to meet that need. And so I understand that line of argument, but if we don't bring climate change into the question at all, then we're missing. We just can't do that. We're missing a huge issue that has to be dealt with. So I would encourage you to check out the websites of the candidates and look for their positions, but I don't think it's we do maintain a nonpartisan role, an advocacy role. Our role is to work with whoever gets elected, wherever they are, whatever positions they have. We speak to everybody. We meet with almost every member of Congress. We're going to be going again in June this year, returning to face-to-face lobbying. So I'll have to ask you to do your own, I think, research on that. But if you find them advocating strongly for just increasing fossil fuel production without any thought to to tackling the issue of climate change, then I think you have your answer. Then you know that they're heading us in a direction which is very dangerous. And one of the things, before I leave that topic, that I want to point out is that this policy that we are backing at the federal level, this Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, it is very flexible. It doesn't shut down the use of fossil fuels, right? It just makes it more expensive unless you're going to be capturing carbon dioxide from those fossil fuels. There is a provision in the bill which says that if you burn fossil fuels, natural gas, coal, whatever it may be, and you capture those emissions and turn them into a product, or you store them underground safely so they can't leak into the atmosphere, you will get a rebate of that fee. Now, right now, there's no cost-effective technology to do that on a broad scale, but nobody's ever had an incentive because there's never been a price on carbon emissions in the United States. So, the bill is extremely flexible, and it allows the flexibility. Let's say in the short term, maybe we do need to increase fossil fuel production for a few years, but at the same time, while we're doing that, we need to be setting a long-term policy which ramps the emissions down and guarantees that the investments we make today will get us to net zero around the 2050 timeframe. So that's, I guess, as much as I can say with respect to candidates and kind of current political topics.
Yeah, thank you. That helps.
Mhm. I'm just looking at the transformative times that we are living in. Everything is just topsy-turvy, let's say. Maybe everybody doesn't see it that way, but I do, and I know there's many people that do. And I think, I don't know how much our federal level is for a new technology, but I think it's been alluded to. This is the point of time where people can become or get involved in new positions, like solar panels and wind turbines and all that. It's going to take people who are educated to do that. So our present educational system really has to start addressing or moving young people to look for some of these jobs and to think and develop new technology for the things that are going to be facing us. It's something to put blinders on, but we can't continue to put blinders on anymore. So how do we convince younger people to begin to dream and look at future positions and jobs and the need to get educated in those directions?
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and I think outreach is really critical. I do a lot of that activity myself. Just earlier this year, there was an event at UT called Introduce a Girl to Engineering Day. Mm-hmm. And they brought in hundreds and hundreds of 7th and 8th grade students, girls specifically, to have them meet people from different companies. There were 3 female engineers from First Solar who went, and I went along with them, and we brought a solar kit so that they could do little experiments with solar cells and power up motors that ran a tiny handheld fan, and then also power a little music chip that actually played the tune "You Are My Sunshine." Mm-hmm. And the students really got a kick out of that. They were, hooking up these little solar cells and powering them, and getting a chance, to be hands-on. And then when they learn about that, at an event like this, maybe they would never have seen that in their school program. Mm-hmm. But if they go to a special event and they see this, I think it may trigger their interest, and they become aware of the company of First Solar and what we're doing, and they know that we're here right in their backyard. So I think that can be a start, is outreach. There's another event like this coming up that First Solar is going to be participating in, and I'll be supporting. It's through Junior Achievement, and it's for high school students. And so we're going to be there as well. Mm-hmm. And I think that, faculty at these institutions can make a difference by identifying these activities and encouraging their students in their classes to participate. Another teacher that I engage with is Donnie Birkin, who teaches at Eastwood Middle School, and he has me come out every year for their career day. So I'll be going out there in May, and we'll again have the solar kit and teach kids about solar panels and what their benefits are. Honestly, I think also I'm going to come back to the issue of advocacy, because I think that has to be connected here. I want to call out specifically and thank Lourdes University for having endorsed the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act as an organization. It's a Catholic university, and out of principle, in solidarity with the principles outlined in Pope Francis's encyclical letter, Laudato Si', the university chose to endorse this particular bill, as has the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, by the way. So I think that it would be entirely appropriate for Catholic schools, Catholic universities, faculty members at these institutions to join this. I was recently very gratified. I called up and spoke with Professor Cindy Molitor, teaches natural science, professor of natural science at Lourdes. She agreed to endorse the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. So, you know, when people stand up and use their voices, I made reference in the subtitle to finding our voices. When we stand up and say, we need this bill is what's necessary to protect people from harm, to ensure that we have a thriving, livable planet for everyone, not just for the wealthy, not just for people who live, you know, in privileged countries, but for everyone. When people stand up, it gets attention, it gets noticed. And then, you know, people will be saying, well, okay, I'll take a look at this. What do we need to do? How do we get there? And I think educational institutions, along with all other institutions, have a responsibility to raise their voices here and spread the word about the technology, the jobs, yes, and about the policy that we need that will drive the technology and the jobs.
Is there a bill number to what you're talking
Yes,
about?
the bill number is House Resolution 2307. 2307.
Uh-huh.
And, you know, I'm always looking, we're constantly on the lookout for people to endorse this. In fact, we're in discussion right now with the City Council in Bowling Green. 5 of the 7 members of the council there have endorsed the bill, and we're seeking to get a resolution introduced into council and passed formally by the City Council to endorse the bill. So this is the kind of thing, you know, Steve Roberts is on the call here with us. I think Dan Burgard also, I saw. Steve is a longtime member of CCL, as is Dan. Steve worked together with others, with Lori Proctor and others, lobbying members of the Toledo City Council. And they did not choose to specifically endorse HR 2307, this particular bill, but the Toledo City Council did endorse the policy framework of carbon fee and dividend, which is also extremely important, just getting that on record. And we were proud, very proud of that effort and proud of the fact that it was a unanimous endorsement. I believe there was one Republican member of the council at the time, correct me, Steve, if I'm wrong about that. So it's not a huge Republican presence. We know it's a Democratic city in general, but there was a Republican council member, and it was a unanimous endorsement. So, you know, this is what's happening. This is what we're doing, but we need more help. We need people willing to go ask, you know, other members of the community to get involved, to join us at tabling events. We're going to be out tabling in May at another event. We were at the EcoFest recently in Toledo. I think the next event is in Oregon on May 14th. So we do tabling. We give presentations. You know, we were also proud to receive the endorsement of Toledo Lucas County League of Women Voters. So we want people to think about all these things. Think about what organizations am I in? Who do I know? Who am I connected to? What audiences might want to hear a talk like this? And that's how we spread the word.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to interrupt the Q&A for a brief moment for a word from our sponsor. I see that we have a number of guests in our audience tonight, and that's wonderful. We welcome you guests to this and all of our lectures, and we welcome you to join SAVE as well for in case you share the interests that you see tonight with the interests of SAVE, as we mentioned at the beginning of the meeting. It's a very nominal membership fee. It's $10 for a senior, $20 for an individual, and $30 for a family. That's not per month, that's per year. So we're not asking for a great deal of money, but we'd like to increase our membership. And you can see the application on sciencealliancesave.org website. So if you would, we'd really like to encourage you to become a member and join us in these efforts. Back to the Q&A session.
Thank you for that, David. Yeah, this is a wonderful organization, and I agree with the speaker at the beginning who said 32 years. That is a tremendous accomplishment. There aren't that many environmental organizations that have been around that long. So hats off to you.
Mhm.
I'll also put in a plug here for Citizens Climate Lobby. If anyone is interested in signing up, and this doesn't mean that you have to come to meetings, there's no time commitment involved. It just means that you'll be notified about the various campaigns that we have. You can go to our website, which is www.citizensclimatelobby.org, and just fill in your information. You'll be added to our roster, and you'll get notice of our meetings based on where you live, whether you're in Toledo, if you're closer to that chapter, or if you're in the 5th Congressional District, then you'll be notified of meetings for the chapter that I'm in, the Perrysburg chapter, and you'll also get notices of actions that we're encouraging people to take, which sometimes is basically as simple as sending an email. I mean, you wouldn't think that would do much, but when you're doing this in coordination with thousands of people across the whole country, it matters. It gets the attention of Congress.
Mhm.
I have a question. It's actually a two-part question about solar. And one thing I've often thought of was geothermal heat. And one of my concerns about solar is how long do those solar panels last? Because I understand there's a lot of chemicals in them. And I know at one time they said they lasted 20 years. So, but I'm hoping that's greater today. But do you know how long solar panels are intended to last?
Yes, that's a really good question. Typically, solar panels come with a power warranty that lasts for about 25 years. That means that the power won't drop below a certain level, a certain percentage of the initial output over those 25 years. Now, their useful life can be longer than that, could be 30, maybe 35 years, but then at some point, they will start to degrade, and it may not make sense to keep them in commission. It would be, at that point, they should really be replaced with a new set of panels, and new panels typically will be better performing. Also, the technology continues to improve. That's what I do with many, many colleagues here at First Solar, is we all work on getting the efficiency of our panels to be higher so that the cost of solar electricity can go down further. So then the question comes, what do you do with these solar panels at the end of life? I think that's what you're getting at.
Yes.
Now, First Solar is a pioneer and a leader in this, in that we have technology for recycling our solar panels, and we can retrieve, don't quote me on the number of this, I should know this, but I think it's almost about 90% of the materials. It's a very, very high percentage of the material we can actually extract out of used solar panels and reuse. However, that is really, that is an added cost, right? To do the recycling costs more. And that is up to whoever is buying the panels and installing them as to what they do with them at end of life. That's not under First Solar's control. And most people, as in most cases, they choose to save money. We all typically do, right? And so the reality is that most of the solar panels being made, the vast majority, are likely going to wind up in a landfill somewhere. Now, you should know that very extensive studies have been done in order to confirm that that is safe to do. Your concern, and it's a valid concern, is, well, are we going to contaminate our drinking water, for example? So I know for a fact, and I can share this with you, that First Solar has done very careful tests of this to prove that, in a landfill, if it's done properly, if you have a proper landfill, you're not going to be leaching out heavy metals, let's say, that are going to contaminate groundwater. So it's not, there is not a significant risk there to our water supplies. However, everyone agrees it's not that desirable to be taking up lots of landfill space with lots of, used and discarded solar panels. So we would hope that in the future that, recycling becomes a larger fraction of that stream. But right now, I have to admit, I think it's pretty limited. So that is
Also,
a downside. And I think we have to acknowledge that no matter what form of energy we use, there are costs.
Mhm.
And so that's why energy conservation always needs to be a part of the mix and always should be the first thing that we do, right? The first thing is to reduce your energy use through conservation, and then to supply what energy needs you have from a low carbon energy source, whether it be solar, wind, geothermal, nuclear, or fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage.
how does geothermal compare in efficiency and cost wise and with solar?
I don't know that as far as electricity is concerned. I would have to look that up, but I don't think it's, my guess is that geothermal for just pure electricity production is more expensive. Where at least in this area, where you tend to see geothermal used is more for heating
Yes.
applications. And I was aware through a conversation with a gentleman who worked in this industry that particularly in the rural areas here, if you have a rural residence with a propane tank to provide your heat, you can probably save money by going geothermal because that propane is quite expensive. And you probably have space available where you can more easily dig the trench that the bore out the tunnel that you need to install the geothermal. You can do it anywhere, but it is expensive because you have to bore out that hole and put the installation in, and it's most cost effective as a replacement for propane heat in rural areas. That's my understanding.
Our e-bike hall at Lourdes is geothermal, and it's amazing. In the summertime, you don't need air conditioning in those rooms, and in the wintertime, you don't need heat. It's just it's just feels really, I don't know, I wouldn't say like maybe around 70 degrees or something all the time. I don't know the exact amount, but seems to work.
Yes, and what might be part of that, not just geothermal, is heat pumps. So heat pumps are a way of using electricity to heat and cool. It's similar to the process that goes on in your refrigerator, where you have a system that compresses a fluid and removes the heat from the interior of the refrigerator and then exhausts that heat into your room. But you can run that kind of process either way. And so one way of, for example, I'm looking into this myself because we have a natural gas water heater, and I'd like to try to replace it with a heat pump version that runs on electricity. And then that at least offers you the prospect that you can, if you source that electricity through low carbon sources, now you have heating for your water heater that's cleaner and low carbon. And that can be done for water heaters. It can be done for home heating systems. So heat pumps are another up-and-coming technology. And the point of this bill is that it will promote all of these technologies. You're going to see a boom in all of this, whether it be heat pumps, electric vehicles, wind, solar, maybe even new fusion, technology. All of this will be promoted when this bill passes because everyone will have an incentive, businesses and consumers alike, to reduce their carbon footprint. And there's so much more we could do. I mean, you think about the effort we put into going to the moon, right? We need that kind of effort now on Earth to save the Earth, honestly, by converting how we get and use energy.
I get a question. What's the latest efficiencies on the solar panels that First Solar is making?
They're up around the 18% level. So, which is good. It's not as high as the efficiency of silicon-based solar panels, but then that's only what we call the nameplate efficiency. Each panel gets a standard test under standard conditions, which is room temperature with full lighting equivalent to the light of sun at the middle of the day. And so that's one way of comparing, one solar panel with another. But that is not the whole story, because solar panels are used in the real world where you have temperature. Sometimes they're operating at maybe 50 degrees C, very, very high temperatures. And sometimes they're operating in lower levels of lighting than full sun. And so there are aspects of the technology that we have, this cadmium telluride technology, that give you benefits for what we call the energy yield over the entire year. And that includes, benefits in terms of the wavelengths of light that our solar panels can absorb. They don't lose as much in their efficiency as they go higher in temperature as the silicon-based panels do. So these advantages recoup and compensate for that lower nameplate efficiency and give us an energy yield that is actually quite competitive. So that's kind of in a nutshell about solar, the cadmium telluride solar technology we produce.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Hey, Bob, this is Dan.
Hi, Dan.
Can you hear me? Hi. I wanted to bring up one thing. That somebody said something about recycling. I retired from First Solar a few years ago, but when I was still working there, each time First Solar sold a solar panel, there was a percentage of it dedicated to recycling. So when the user wanted to get their panels recycled, they could send them to us and we wouldn't charge them to receive panels. Whereas if you go to a landfill or something, there's probably some kind of cost to dump stuff there. So First Solar would take them back for free, and they always had this budget set aside to recycle. So it was kind of an incentive to go ahead and change them out and keep them up to date.
Mm-hmm.
That was a program in the beginning of the company. That program was ended. I don't remember exactly when, but it was a number of years ago. I think it might have been, I've been with the company almost 10 years. I think it might have been 8 years ago or so, something like that. Because in order to do that, so yeah, the idea that Dan was describing was charge that fee up front, right? Put a little bit of cost into the product, set aside so that it's guaranteed that that panel will get recycled. But again, that's extra cost. And solar is an extremely competitive market. Everybody wants electricity at the lowest possible cost, and so they want their panels at the lowest possible cost. And since not everybody was going to do that, there just wasn't, there wasn't a way to sustain that program. So that's not currently in effect anymore.
All right. Well, thanks for correcting me on that.
Yeah.
Well, it is about time. We're hitting 9 o'clock and we've had a very invigorating discussion and question and answers and a very invigorating talk. We'd like to thank you, Bob, for coming on tonight to present this. And it will be on YouTube within, I don't know how many minutes. John will make sure that it gets on YouTube. And there was I don't remember the whole thing, but last year, you can look on our website and there was a speaker that showed how solar panels were made. It is amazing, all the parts and levels that go on into making these solar panels. So if anybody's interested, you might want to just go on our website and look for last year's lecture series and see, what that topic was. I don't recall it exactly. We are also having a Save Awards night on Zoom again this year. We offer a number of awards. We'd like people to come on and celebrate with other people that are doing stuff, for the environment. So, if you can afford the time, it probably will be an hour's worth of time to be able to listen to what people have done that gives them this award. Not that it's, you know, so important, but it is. And some of these people have never, ever gotten an award. And we give them for service. We give them for education, for schools, for faith groups, for community at large, for friends of the environment, and for service. So 1 hour would be really nice. And the meeting ID is on here and the passcode. There will also be a link to the Zoom link, the whole Zoom link, so that you can see that and join us. We thank you for coming this evening. Have a great night. And thanks, Bob, once again for giving us this invigorating lecture.